Good
I,
morning.
I think it's that time.
I think so.
Yeah. So welcome, everybody. We're very happy and excited that you are here. Let me start by introducing myself. My name is Betty Ann Howard, and I deliver the Donor Motivation Program in Eastern Ontario, so primarily Kingston and Ottawa. And I'm also very active with the Canadian Association of Gift Planners. I'm the co-chair of the Ottawa chapter. And I pretty much love everything that CAGP does. So we're so glad to be partnering with for these campfire chats. And I am delighted to introduce you to my guest today, Susan Jackson, who is located in Toronto. She's with the United Jewish Appeal. And I want to share with you that I'm sure lots of people know who Jack Silverstein is. He's written the book, Tales from the Trenches, and he also has a podcast. And we've been working diligently on getting the message out and identifying the needs of women when it comes to philanthropy and planned giving. And last year, we did a couple of sessions from women's perspective, from financial advisor perspective, and we'll be talking more about charities perspective in terms of creating and developing programs for women. So I said to Jack, who should I talk to? Who do you know that I could talk to who has had a magnificent career, 40 years, in meeting the needs of women? And he said, you have to talk to Susan Jackson. So I reached out to her and we've had many lovely conversations. We have yet to meet in person, but we can't wait to meet in person. And I'm just so thrilled that Susan is my guest today. And we're going to be talking about, because Susan started doing this work 40 years ago, so we'll be talking about the evolution of meeting the needs of women. We'll be talking about mindset. We'll be talking about all kinds of things. So I'm very excited that Susan is here and is joining me. And I'm going to start by asking Susan to talk about her cocktail of choice, because there's a story behind that.
Cocktail. So I understood that we were supposed to think about the cocktail this morning. It's a little early for me, but it's 5 o'clock somewhere for sure. So the truth of the matter is I'm a single malt neat drinker. So I have to think about cocktails. So my favorite cocktail is a rusty nail, which is Scotch and Drambuie. I do have roots in Scotland and in England, my grandparents and my great-grandparents. And my father's line, whenever anybody came for dinner and brought my mother as a gift a bottle of rye, he would say, don't bring them back. Don't invite them again, game over. So that is my favorite, and it has roots and it has history. And everything we're gonna talk about today has roots and has history.
That's great, thanks, Susan. And my cocktail of choice, there is a company in Gananoque, 2 young women who've set up a business of putting all of the ingredients together. All you have to do is add the alcohol and do a bit of planning, give it 3 days. So this is actually a raspberry mimosa. And I had mimosas over Christmas. And all you need to do is add some Prosecco or whatever type of alcohol, let it do its thing for 3 days. And they're lovely, lovely cocktails. They have sangria. So I know Serena said that at the end of everything, when we send out the recordings, we'll give you a link and share in more specifically about our preferred drinks. So Susan, I thought it would be great if we started off by you addressing, so as I said, you've had over 4 decades appealing to and working with women and setting up programs for women. So it would be fantastic if you could share some of the information you've already shared with me, actually, in terms of the evolution of that, like kind of where you got started, because charities that are participating are at different stages of them wanting to appeal and meet the needs of women. And I know you've done an exemplary job of doing that, while at the same time recognizing that it doesn't that sometimes you have to, reboot the whole thing, and you've been a part of that as well. So if you could please start by talking about what you've seen over the past 4 decades in terms of the evolution of meeting the needs for women in philanthropy.
So I'm really not so special. I'm just old. So I've been around. I've done it for a long time. I started straight out of school. I think when I frame this, what's really important to understand is I've worked within the field of women's philanthropy for all of those years, but it's not the only thing I've done. So I have that bigger framework, and we'll talk about that a little bit. When I moved to Toronto, so I lived in London, Ontario for 3 years. I'm from Montreal originally, so I have a bit of a geographic scope. When I started in '82, yes, fresh out of school, I'm not going to tell you how old, so you can't count backwards and figure out how old I am. But when I began, the world for women in philanthropy looked very, very different. And it was one of all of those campaigns primarily were focused at the husbands. And when you take a look at that piece of the puzzle and start thinking about it, it was really in the 70s and the early 80s that the women busted out of that mold. And we realized from a professional perspective, women were professionals. They were writing their own checks. They had their own incomes. That women who were single were powerhouses, and that all of those needs and the philanthropy and the finances were very different than in the 40s and the 50s and even in the early 60s. But there was in fact a glass ceiling, because what we found is that a lot of the women in the 70s and the 80s didn't want to participate because it was a man's world, so to speak, right? Often, the 70s, they were felt shut down, left out of conversations, rightfully or wrongfully. So it was at that point that this concept of business and professional women started. Women started branching out within the different R's in particular, but different organizations on their own, set up their own divisions, their own fundraising strategies. And there was something about the sisterhood, no question, but they felt that working together for the cause, their leadership skills were honed. Then what started to happen, which was really fascinating, was really in the early 90s, all of a sudden there was a shift. They were more accepted as philanthropists in the bigger context. And then all of a sudden they said, oh, we don't want to sit here just with women. We want to hang out in this mixed group so that our ideas flow together. So then again, you found that women's philanthropy became stronger because women were mixing back and forth. Often if they were accountants, they wanted to be with all the accountants, not just the women's accountants, and they got the best of both worlds. They were able to work in their philanthropic world with men and women together and different levels of philanthropy and different programs, but yet they still maintained that women's philanthropy. They still maintained those programs that spoke to their needs and that dealt with financial advisors. And then we started to see this interesting shift of these older women who ended up widows and had never done philanthropy on their own, and started looking at programs on how to keep them in the community, because in fact, these folks are lonely and the whole world falls apart, and it becomes their community, their social values, and their structure. So that started happening in the 80s, and it kept moving. Today, we have a really interesting structure where women are not apart and separate, where women are integrated into the entire philanthropic landscape, but there is still a women's campaign. There is still programming geared specifically to their financial needs, their philanthropic needs, their family needs, so that you don't miss that piece of the sisterhood, while at the same time recognizing these women are powerhouses just like anybody else in the community. So that's in a very brief nutshell, the short history over the last 40, 50 years.
Yeah. And Susan, I like how you describe with the evolution, a starting point being of women talking, gathering together, the sisterhood, as you call it, and then doing more integrated work while still maintaining a separate group, because women feel more comfortable talking about their needs, sharing what their needs are, and women's needs are quite different. And so it's been interesting to see that evolution. And you shared, in one of the other conversations that we had, you shared with me part of that evolution, and I'm wondering if you want to comment about this, just that, as you said, women, during a certain period, women stayed at home. Then it was, no, I'm not going to stay at home and raise the kids. I'm going to be out working. And then it was, well, really, I do want to be at home taking care of the kids. And yet they're professionals. And you did something like that was part of your evolution as well, right? Like you quickly identified that there's this group of women who are professionals who have very different needs now that they're staying at home and raising their families. Would you care to comment on that?
Yeah, I think I called them my conflicted. I called them the conflicted. That we identified this phenomenal group of women in high-powered positions, well-educated, financial positions, doctors, lawyers, accountants, business entrepreneurs, all kinds, who really, it was very important for them to build their careers and all the rest. When they, in fact, then began to start their families, they were very adamant that we're going back to work and we're going to do it. And a lot of them saw, after they had their first child, that they didn't really raise their kids the way they were hoping to be involved in raising them, because they had to figure out how to split their time. And then all of a sudden, they thought when they had their next child, they're going to leave, they're going to work in the home. They're going to leave that big professional world for now and raise a family. What happens often is it's hard to get back into the workforce, which is a whole other conversation that we can have on a different level. And they also found they really enjoyed having time with their families and doing that kind of development. But they had time, because you're talking about women, high-powered, well-educated women with big careers that now, yeah, they're raising their family, but the kids are in school during the day. And the kids go to bed at night, and their partner is there at night. What's the story? What do we do with them? These phenomenal women then almost become, can we make them professional volunteers? Can we bring them in on the philanthropy side to work hand in hand in partnership with the professionals? Key here, because I'm talking to professionals, that partnership between the lay leadership and the professionals. And can we bring them in, and what can they do? And I saw immediately an elevation of the kind of work that's being done. Was remarkable, because you've got these women who are desperate to do professional work and to keep their finger in the pot. Now, on the other hand, down the road, years later, some of these women actually didn't go back into the workforce that they were in at that time, at the beginning, before they had their kids or before they had their second, and the community lucks out. Because in fact, that sophisticated strategic thinking and the work that's been done in terms of identifying philanthropic needs, identifying needs in the community. They're the wonderful canvassers, canvassing in their field, soliciting gifts in their field. So we identified those groups at those stages in their life, and it's been a remarkably fruitful addition to the community on who's actually doing the work and bringing in the dollars.
That's a great example of you, as you said, you saw what was going on, you observed, and you said, what about and what if we were to do this? Now, there are still some people who maintain that, like, why have programs specifically for women? So what has your experience been, and how would you answer that?
Yeah, it's an interesting one, right? Because there are some women who have no interest in programming or solicitation work, just with women, and that's fine. That's perfectly fine. That's why we're all in a large structure, etc., unless it is a specific women's philanthropy group, the different women's groups in the community. And the way we answer it is very simple. It's not about being separate and apart. It's about, I'll give you an example of an actual program. Women's philanthropy does, program every year where they bring in somebody to educate, some kind of speaker. They do it at a lunch, they do it at a dinner. This was at a lovely evening where it was at the Aga Khan Museum, beautiful facility. And we had cocktails and dinner and then they go into the auditorium for the program. And the idea is something that will educate, something that's topical. And Monica Lewinsky came to speak. And that was fascinating in its own way, right? We had a group of the older ladies who didn't want to come and hear her because they only heard one side of her story, and the young women who were thrilled to see her as this phenomenal, strong entrepreneur who's come through things. We had a phenomenal turnout. We opened it if they wanted. Of course, a spouse can come, but they didn't. There was an interest in the Q&A to ask her questions that she's always happy to answer, that they felt it was a more comfortable environment. So it's not a matter of what, you should make anything separate. It's much more a matter of, I honestly believe there's no silver bullet in anything. There isn't one way to do things. So you have to put as much out there to expose people to values, to the concept of whatever the philanthropy is, etc. So for a group, not a monolithic group, for different groups of women, the idea of being together speaks to them. And if it doesn't, that's okay. But you have to have a professional and lay leadership who are monitoring that and who are walking it and who are being really have the finger on the pulse of what is it that will bring them in and what does speak to them. Same way as when we're doing, family philanthropy, the second gen has very different thoughts and processes on what and how they want to spend their charitable dollars than the parents. But you bring them in a room, watch it and hear it, and then afterwards you're able to separate it out in a niche and make sure that each different group gets what they want.
Yeah, and Susan, I think that because this has been part of another one of our conversations when we've talked about women and women's need, it's the whole vulnerability. So certainly the Monica Lewinsky event, I think what you're saying is that as a result of it being women there and being able to, some women relating to the experience and other women being open to hearing a whole other perspective about her experience and being able to be vulnerable. And I found it interesting that you said you have to have your finger on the pulse. So how do you do that for charities that are, in the audience? I'm sure they'd be interested in knowing what are the types of things that you do to have your finger on the pulse.
Oh, for me, there are a number of keys. Number one, I think everybody can see I'm like you, very shy, very quiet, right? So listening, I don't have to tell anybody who's watching, listening is key and picking up cues is key. The other thing is, I believe in dialogue. I think dialogue is the most important piece of any puzzle. And I will start a conversation where somebody's at and ask questions and they ask questions. And you'll find, I think we've all found this, when you go and you see a donor and you sit down and you come in and your whole thing is to give a presentation, you'll never have the same level of commitment and engagement with them as when you come in and start the conversations with questions about them and their needs and what they're thinking. So their needs and what they're thinking for me are key and are the start to all of this, because that's how you get the finger on the pulse. I also listen carefully to hear what they say about their kids, because let me tell you, they say plenty about their kids. And then I do my best to try and wheedle my way into a conversation with their kids to see if what they're saying is matching and where there are disconnects. Often you'll hear the parents talking about, for us, it's the importance of the word in Hebrew is kupah, the central fund, the core dollars, right? It's a united appeal. The idea that we have a core charitable pot and we have expert committees that look at the community, figure out what the priorities are and where the money needs to go. And from there, we have that ability to pivot because it goes into that core pot. And when we start to talk to young people and they start to talk about, well, I'm not interested in a core pot anymore. I'm interested in direct philanthropy. I want to know that my money bought a piece of an incubator. I want it, right? Because you hear the younger generation talking about follow your dollar, right? Those kinds of things. So you listen and you hear, and how are you going to enable the younger generation to follow their dollar, which is still within the core and the priorities that the community needs? So the key is those conversations and the listening. We have a very bad habit of reading studies and then thinking we know everything. We need to read the study and then see how it applies to the audiences that we're targeting. So there's lots of data out there, right? We are now a data-driven and measurement world, right? That's it now. What's the data? What's the anecdotal, my favorite things, the stories, come after the analytical piece of the puzzle today, right? How are you measuring it? What's the data? Where did it come from? Those are incredibly important tools and pieces of the puzzle, but then you have to take that and use that to start a conversation, because you will find something different. Somebody, I think I told you this, somebody who used to run our creative department, in our marketing department, once said she was reading all kinds of literature about millennials, my very favorite group in the whole world. I just love millennials. And she said what she learned is that they are the most difficult group to market to because they are not monolithic in any way, shape, or form. The literature talks about the boomer. You basically knew what a boomer was. You knew what they wanted. You knew where they came from. You knew what their history is. You knew what they want. Yes, there's right, there's left. There's shades of gray. But that this concept of niche marketing to this next gen is really important. Same with philanthropy. So there's a lot of niche concepts.
And it sounds like you are also saying that there's also niche marketing specifically for women, in order to support, encourage, and to raise the profile, if you will, because I know Teresa, who I think is on this webinar, did a fantastic webinar about female philanthropists being unseen, unheard, and unrecognized. So what's your experience been like when I say that? What's your experience been in relation to that?
So I would say that for the last 20 years, I see a huge shift, not only seen and heard, but in many families and in many individuals leading the philanthropy. We had this concept of, no great man is without a great woman behind him, right? That old adage, right? That we used to talk about. We're out in front now, and we're partners now, much more than we ever were. So the idea, what we tried really hard to put out there is the idea of when you're going to talk to a family about their philanthropy, you're engaging the woman the same way you're engaging the man. That in those terms. You're also engaging women today in a different frame. I never today think of looking at it, we'll go to him and then she's an afterthought. So what they'll tell you, it's the old story. We haven't broken the glass ceiling, we've cracked it. So there are still segments within all of our work within society, which is exactly as you described, Serena had talked about, unheard, the invisible and all the rest. And that's, you have to make it a priority. It's not going to happen on its own. You're always going to have one or two leaders, female leaders, who come out strong and hard, right? Because that's who they are. But it has to be part of the principles of the work that you're doing within your organization, so that equity comes out. And you're going to see, especially, we all know about the trillions of dollars passage of wealth that's coming in the next generation. 50% of them are women. A huge percentage of them control the wealth that percentage control the wealth 20, 30, and 40 years ago.
And so, Susan, could you elaborate on the principles? I think that's really key. And because you said that the principles need to be there within the charity to create an environment, if you will, so that we can meet the needs of female philanthropists.
So it's very, very simple. When we're going in, the organization actually has, as part of its mission or its goals, literally part of it is engaging the women on an equal level in everything that they do. Literally, we have to talk about it. It's not a matter of saying, yeah, don't worry, right? It's the old story. Yeah, it's so important that everybody has it, and you have to articulate it. And I find often I was the one at the table who would often say, I'm not sure that's going to speak to the women in the banking industry and the finance industry because X, Y, and Z. One of the things we stumbled across was a group of female doctors who said that they aren't working 80 hours a week when they were having their children, right? It's a profession where they can work part-time and all the rest of it, which is really, really important. And we thought about that, and we thought about, okay, how do we address the hours that they are working, and how can we engage them? But we talk about it. And I think it's nonsense, this nonsense where I'll often hear, oh, Susan, don't be ridiculous. Women are on par now. It's all equal. Everything is fine. It's going to be interwoven into everything. Don't worry about it. Therefore, don't articulate it all the time. No, you have to keep reminding ourselves. In the world that I live in, when we're talking about values and identity, right? We're constantly reminding ourselves of our values and the identity, right? Same here. We're reminding ourselves that the value, everyone is a value member of the community, and we aren't quite at the point where everything is equal yet. So articulate it, talk about it. That's the key for me.
Yeah, and on that note, so I love that. And also, I know another conversation we had is the importance of charities being aware of that there are different types of families, there are same-sex couples, there are, and that needs to be apparent, that you understand, that charities understand that in the same way that you're saying, articulate, make sure that women know that that you want to meet their needs. And in many cases, women have similar needs, but also different needs when it comes to philanthropy.
Yeah, and that's going to end up costing you more time. And we have to understand in the next generation the resources that are going to be there, because you're right. Families look different today than they did 100 years ago, than they did 50 years ago. Also, the transfer down, think about it, not the eldest child or the eldest son. I mean, today we have a particular donor family he's got 5 adult children. Right now, he controls the philanthropy. But we need to have relationships with all of those kids because it's going to change. I mean, they're close to 90. It's going to change. So you need to understand the needs. And when you do that, it's no longer the elder son. It's 5 kids, of which half are women. And you're going to have to take a look at those different, not only different kinds of families, but different distribution of time because of the number of people you're going to have to engage and how you're going to have to engage them in different ways in order to get the same gift that you got just from daddy and mommy. So it becomes it's one of the things we look at now. What are the resources in 20 years that we're going to have in place to get the same level of charitable donation that we have today? Very different with the splitting up and different needs. Again, back to the listening, right? And yeah, you got to listen. It's the same thing with women in different blended families and different kinds of families. You got to listen.
Yeah.
You got to listen.
I wanted to talk a bit more too about mindset and about community impact. And I think that they I'm sure they are connected. I want to hear your thoughts about this, especially from a mindset point of view, because I know, Susan, you and I have talked about how, there's no such thing as failure. So could you comment on that, and then also comment, because I know we just have about 3 minutes left, comment on community impact.
And someone asked for a concrete example. Yeah, sure. So there was a book a number of years ago that came out called Startup Nation. One of the authors' last name was Senor, and he's actually originally from Toronto. And it looked at and talked about how Israel is the startup nation, right? They have more startups per capita than anybody else in the world. And when you read, one of the things they talk about is that there's no such thing as failure. Everything is a learning experience. Everything is learning. That's what it's all about. That's something, if you want to talk about where I work my rear end off, it's trying to bring that philosophy to the philanthropic tables that I work at. There is no such thing as we do pilots. If you don't experiment, try and innovate, you're not going to move into the next generation. You're not going to listen to what they're saying, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Now, I come from a community-based organization, a value-based organization, which many, I saw the list, many online do as well. And I think it's really important for us to understand that when we there's engagement and there's impact, right? How do we engage our donors? How do we engage these philanthropists in the work? We do by making sure what we're doing means something to them. And once it does, and they see clearly that A, it matters to them. B, it matters to the community that they are a part of. They will become more engaged, not just in writing the check, but in promoting the concept. And I think that that's a really important piece of the philanthropic puzzle as well. And somebody asked for, a direct, an example, and there's all kinds of examples here. Do one very, very small one, simple. Identified the fact that we always did what we call a line at the level of giving, a lion lunch. We did it like at the Four Seasons, whatever. Every year in the middle of the day, we brought a fantastic speaker, 12 to 2. They had food, they were excited, they learned something, they got dressed up, and they were so happy. What did we realize? The working women almost had a heart attack half the time because they couldn't take off the 2 hours plus the travel time there and back. And identified something simple. We now still do it, of course. But of course, we have a business networking event in the evening now as well. Simple, something really simple. All of a sudden, we have a different group of women coming completely. So again, the idea of different things for different folks, but the idea of watching, learning, and listening, that's what makes a success. And that has given us a success in the next gen. The younger women are coming out.
And sorry, Susan, but what really stood out for me with that example is when you said, and so the women were having a heart attack for this event during the day, you did a business women's networking. If you build it, they'll come, right? So you built this, and then you started attracting all sorts of other business women who were and are philanthropic. We have one minute left. I'm going to give you 30 seconds because I have to thank you, or I want to thank you with any parting words.
Oh, parting words. Parting words are thank you for having me, number one. Number two, parting words are I'm always around. Anyone who wants a conversation, with pleasure, and start to listen. start to have those conversations and start to take the data that you're looking at and reading and use it in a conversation and try to extrapolate from the individual what it means to them and what they're really thinking and feeling. It'll let you identify their hot buttons and you'll have a much more rich engagement with them.
And I would add also be aware of your assumptions you're making so that you stay open through exploration and curiosity to find out also, because we talk about data informed versus data driven. And I think the data, exactly as you're saying, Susan, that you're informed. So thank you. I was going to say, if people want to get in touch with you, they have to get in line because you and I have to keep talking.
There we go. That's right. Absolutely.
Yeah. So thanks so much, Susan. It's been delightful, and we really appreciate you joining us. And I also know that you're going to be a part of some of our additional series that we're going to be doing on women in philanthropy. So we'll be able to go even deeper and further with this conversation.
Absolutely. With pleasure. Thanks everybody for having me. It was really a delight.